All right, I think all systems are go here. I know that usually I like to be 10:02 up and running, but it took me a little longer. I don't feel too bad about that because we took a little while to get settled, and it's already been a very hectic day. You know, for me, it's the first day of school for all my kids, first day of NFL football season, so, you know, got a lot going on. Anyways, before I dive into what we're going to talk about today, we do have this open house for our business certificate program. You can see all the information here, and there's the QR code if you want some more information. Yeah, that's going on. It looks like Tuesday, September 10. If you have any other questions, I think you follow the QR code. That should do the trick here. I'll try to put this up again at the end of class for those who are interested. But for now, I think I have to dive into the material for the day here. So you will notice, this is lecture 2, by the way, you will notice I've added a couple of more chapters on Top Hat for reading. And I also, as I was sort of thinking about what happened in last class, I was thinking a little bit about some of the things I did not get to talk about that I might want to mention. And one of which is to just once again verify for you how Top Hat works and what's there and all that stuff and what sorts of things you can find. Another is to detail kind of a difference in what I have in mind for the book questions, the questions that are interlaced with all the chapters, and also the homework questions. So let's see here. Let me just look at my laundry list here. Okay, chapters 3 and 4, they're pretty light. There's 2 homeworks up there now. I say here, note the due date for the homework. That's because the due date, I think I said, is October 2nd for both. That's around the time I have in mind for the first exam. It's not the exact date, but that's about the time we're looking at here. And people have asked, the homeworks will stay open until then, right? So you can do them over and over again. You can, fix them up if you made some mistakes. You'll have them to study, right, for the exam. They'll be there up until then. You don't have to do them technically until then, but I would prefer that you kind of did them along with the lecture. Yes?
Question. So you mentioned about you can correct your homework. Will you, so for example, if you get a question wrong, resubmit it and get it right, will you gain all the points, or will you? I only take your highest grade. That was a good question. If you redo your homework, what happens? I only take the highest grade that you've gotten on your homework in the time that you've, so I don't, if you click through and just take zeros, that doesn't matter if you eventually fix all of the zeros. Good question. Oh yeah, also Top Hat here. What I'll do is I'll talk about Top Hat, and then I will discuss this difference between book questions and homework questions. So, by the way, this is roughly what you should see if you log into Top Hat. I'm logged in here as a student, so you click on this. This is your course. I guess whatever. Oh my God. Okay, and then the first thing that pops up, this is the top menu item here, is this course information table, right? Or maybe we should call it a matrix. That sounds a little bit more impressive, right? And you can see here it has kind of a running chronology of what's going on in the class. Over here you can see the stuff that I've assigned at this date, that's assigned as of this time. And you'll see here various links. So here are all of my lecture notes, right? They go to my Google slide deck. And there's a recording of the lecture. I don't know how this, I should check and see if this link works. I'll give it a try here.
So this is something like,
oh God. So if you have to watch the lecture, oh man, you can see that the production quality is a little bit lacking. I'm not out here, I'm not Mr. Beast or anything. So, they're not very good, but if you miss something in class, you should at least be able to get an idea how it works. And if you have any suggestions as to how to make better videos, I know a lot of people in Hunter have some experience in the fine arts. I'm all ears, right? You can even make comments on YouTube. That's where the videos are. And if Baker, your videos are horrible, I'm fine with that. I can take criticism. But if you have ideas, please let me know. One other thing I was going to say about that. I can't remember what it was. Okay. If it comes to me, I'll mention it. Okay, homework, you click on this. This is the homework that on the syllabus, right, I say 20% of your grade is homework. That's this homework in this folder here that says homework, right? Homework 1, homework 2, you see the due dates there. They're pretty so far kind of light. They have some kind of interesting questions, and we can have some fun looking at these, looking at answers. We'll probably do this next time. I always enjoy looking at this, the answer to this question. So where were your parents? Where was I born? I was born here, right? Anyways, so there's those questions. This second problem set is a little bit more serious, and it'll pertain to some of the things that we do today. In terms of the textbook questions, you can see here 4 chapters, and there are these questions interlaced with the chapter. Now, those you do not have to do for a grade, right? I usually treat these questions as extra credit, right? And you can see that there is no due date for these questions. It's because you can work on them at any time from now up until the end of the semester. They are extra credit. What I usually do is I just look at the fraction of questions you've completed in good faith, right? I can see all your answers. And then, based on that, I add maybe a point or two to your final exam or your final numerical average in the class. Why do I do this? Well, the idea is, it's not going to happen this semester. But in past semesters, somebody always says, well, I don't know what happened. I didn't do that well on the exams, but I did all the work. I did all the reading. And I say, well, I can't verify whether or not you actually did all the reading. This way I can, right? I can at least say, hey, you did all the questions in the chapters, so maybe that's my way of kind of, giving you a safety net, I'll say, or a little bit of a safety net in the event that exams don't go the way that you hoped. Though I know that this semester that's not going to happen. Okay, so there's Top Hat, and I think that's about all I have to say about that. Okay. I might as well just dive right in here. I took a little bit longer with that stuff than I wanted to. Okay, so last time we talked a little bit about some of the big ideas, right, and pertaining to, we didn't talk about international trade. We'll get to that a little bit today. We talked a little bit about efficiency concepts and things like that. We're going to get more into that this class. We're going to talk about this thing called the production possibilities frontier and maybe even a little bit of international trade. But let's first let me remind you, it's been a week. Right, so let me remind you what's happened since last time, or the big key components that we'll use this time, I guess I could say. First, we talked about this point of departure for all of economics, really, that decision makers are rational, right? Okay, that's right off the bat. We have questions. Who are the decision makers? And we decided they could be just about anyone. Businesses, people, countries, right, anybody. And what we do is we assume that they behave rationally, or that they make decisions that are rational. And what we mean by this is that we can define an objective, right? We can define an objective that they pursue, that a decision maker pursues, and then they act to achieve this objective, right? So one example we had is a business maybe makes decisions to maximize profits, right? And we use that as our organizing principle. Consumers, we saw, maybe maximize their own well-being. That's a little bit more difficult to define, but we'll get into that a little bit, right? Today, maybe not today, but maybe next time. So one of the interesting things about this is it doesn't seem like much, but once you couple this with a little bit of technique and maybe some numbers, you can actually infer rather interesting things just by observing the decisions that people make. So one example, very simple example, someone buys a soda, right? You might say, well, that's nice. They have a soda, I'm thirsty or whatever. An economist would say, aha, we've witnessed a soda change hands in the marketplace. That means that the person who purchased the soda valued having the soda more than the money they gave up, right? So, for example, if I pay $1.50 for a soda, that means I value it at something more than that, right? By the same token, whoever produced the soda or sold it to me, well, they like my money more than it cost them to produce the soda, right? You can think about that in any number of ways. You can say the retailer bought the soda for less than $1.50 and is making money on a profit margin there, right? Or you could even think about the Coca-Cola company and the variety of things they buy that they change into the soda, right? Those things evidently cost less than the $1.50 I give up for it. Okay. One thing about this, so I wrote up here the great wallet controversy. I had this thing going and this is maybe an interesting thing that emphasizes something else about this, that some of the choices we don't make are also informative. So in this particular case, I was in the market for a new wallet. And it kept popping up on, whenever I go onto, the internet, Google, whatever, it would say, there's this wallet for sale. I was like, that's kind of a nice wallet. And it would be $35. I'd be like, I think I'd buy that for $35. And then when I would click on the link, suddenly the price would be $60. And I'd be like, I'm not buying it for $60. Right? But notice an economist might observe my behavior and say, well, Baker therefore values that wallet somewhere between 35 and 60, right? If we had to say what his dollar value was of that wallet, well, he's not buying it. They're sucking him in at the price of 60. If I sound a little angry, I am, I guess, irritated by that. But then, or they're sucking me in with the price of 35, but then suddenly on the website it's 60. So I would buy, but I'm not, right, between those two prices. More generally speaking, one thing that we decided last time was that typically when parties trade, it's because both parties gain from this. And this will be kind of a recurring theme, talking about some of the mechanics of this and some technique we can use to think about these sort of mutually beneficial exchanges is a big theme of the course. Before we get there, we're going to say a little bit more about this fundamental idea of scarcity, and really what we're going to do is, well, I guess we can think about this in a couple of ways. We're going to define a couple concepts so we all know what we're talking about when we say something is scarce. We're going to define this concept opportunity cost in a little bit more detail, right? Eventually we'll use this to talk about trade and specialization, and we're going to develop this production possibilities frontier along the way here. So really this is kind of an introduction to, as we define some concepts, it's also a practical introduction to building what we think of as an economic model, right? That is to say, it's a way of showing you how economists think about problems in general. And you'll see that the result is this very simple two-dimensional graph. By that I mean it has an x and a y axis and nothing else. And we're going to think a little bit about how maybe that's not as restrictive as it sounds when I talk about this situational definition of these two dimensions. So before we even get to this graph, what we're going to do is talk a little bit or I'll sort of walk you through the way we might create this problem and the way economists typically think about things. Even, you're giving a presentation, a seminar, whatever, you're talking about your theory or your analysis. Oftentimes what you do is you start off with a very simple, specific example, right? This is just an easy way to think about things, get your thoughts organized and all of that. And so here's an example. Maybe you're a CEO, maybe you're running a big company, right? We might as well use an example that's fun to, think about future. And you're dealing with a specific factory, right? You're thinking about, maybe your company is a multinational, it makes a lot of products, and you're sort of interacting with the factory manager to figure out what you should do with this factory, right? How to use it best. That's a good example. We'll think a little bit about the intuition behind the example, but then what we want to do is say, okay, we have these things that we've developed in this context. What can we say in general from this specific example, right? Generalize. And then once you generalize, you really have a theory that you can then apply to all these different situations, right? That is to say, find some applications. At the end of the day, maybe what you want to do is you want to then say, okay, well, I simplified things a lot in making my model here. Whenever you simplify, you make assumptions, and the question then becomes, what if we relax the assumptions? Or which ones are really critical? Where will this example break down? And indeed, we often neglect this last part, but in some ways it's one of the best things about models, is you can kind of see exactly what the limitations are. So let's run with this example. You're the CEO, right? Large corporation. We'll suppose that the corporation can make bikes, right? Bicycles, and maybe some other stuff, right? So I actually looked before class to see. I have a company that can ultimately make both bikes and smartphones. I had a hard time finding one of those, but in the back of my mind, phones, right? In the back of my mind, I had in mind Panasonic, right? From when I was a kid, they used to make both stereos and bicycles, so that's a little bit different. Nobody has a stereo anymore. Anyways, so let's suppose you put a simple question to the manager and you say, okay, well, how many bikes can you make with the resources at your disposal? I've set you up with this factory. You have raw materials, metal, rare earth metals, cables, wires, computers, workers, a building, all of that stuff. This is what I'm going to be able to give you this year. How much can you make with this? How many bikes can you make with this, with these resources? So your manager, your engineer maybe, goes to the factory, does some research, all this stuff, comes back with a number, right? 14 million bikes in a year. And you say, oh, okay, that's interesting. So that's the number, and the manager says yes, and you say, really? Well, how about if you stagger shifts? I'm just making all this stuff up. You have some ideas about how to improve production and all that stuff. And the manager says, okay, well, we can rearrange things, and if we really fine-tune everything to the best of our abilities here, as the best as possible, 15 million bikes a year, that's it. Then we're up against it. That's when we have everything working at full capacity. And you say, okay, so now you say, okay, well, now I have an idea. Out of this factory, I can count on 15 million bikes a year. Yes?
What does staggering shifts mean?
I'm not really sure. Let's see, staggering shifts. So maybe now instead of, as some people are coming in, the other people are going out, but it's kind of simultaneous. That explains nothing, which was kind of the idea. I don't know. I was just making up some technical mumbo jumbo to make it seem like I knew what I was talking about. But the idea is we fine-tuned the production. We optimized the production process there. Maybe I'll change that for my second lecture. Okay. So you do a little research and you say, maybe we can get into the iPhone or the phone business, right? So you say, we have all this stuff. Most of it goes into phone production, right? Maybe we can just, rearrange our factory and get some phones out of there too. Bike market maybe is a little soft. I don't know. Just thinking, you're the CEO. So you say to your manager, suppose I asked you to also make 1 million phones in a year. What would happen? How would that change what you're doing with bike production? So manager comes back a few days later with this number, 14 million bikes, 1 million phones, best case scenario. You say, okay, that's interesting. So to sort of foreshadow what will follow, when I decide to make 1 million phones, I in some sense lose 15 million or 1 million bikes, right? I've gone from 15 to 14 million bikes. So, maybe I'm thinking, oh, well, that's interesting. What if I wanted to make 2 million phones, right? An additional 1 million phones is what I mean here. Well, you say this, the manager does some research and says, okay, well, we can do 12 million bikes and 2 million phones, right? And you say, really, that's interesting. Why did you only lose 1 million bikes, right, as you think about the data here? Why did you only lose 1 million bikes for that first batch of phones, but then 2 million for the second, right? What do I mean by this statement? It's a little bit weird, a little bit strange way to think about it, but if you parse it out, this is kind of what our manager is telling us, right? When we made that first million phones, production went from 15 to 14 of bikes, right? When we increased production by an additional million, going from 1 million to 2 million, production has now fallen from 14 to 12. Weird, huh? You say, wait, why did that happen? And you might ask your manager, why did it happen? Does anybody have a wild guess why that might have happened? Well, you might have gone ahead in my lecture notes, so maybe I'll go to the manager's explanation here. The manager says, well, when we set up this factory with specific uses, you know, everything was kind of tailored to bike production, but a lot of those were pretty easy initially anyways to convert to phone production, right? We had some engineers, some computer engineers, people like that. It was pretty easy to move them from one thing to the next, right? Some resources, maybe some of the electronics, rare earth metals. I'm making all this up again. I know nothing about bike or phone production, but you get the idea. Some things were easy to shift, and we did that. We took that low-hanging fruit for that first shift, right? Well, when you ask for 1 million more phones, that became a little harder, right? We started shifting things that really mattered for bike production out of bike production into phone production. Hence, only getting an additional 1 million phones out of that and losing an additional 2 million bikes, right? So you say, wow, interesting. The more phones we make at this factory, the harder it is to make more of them, right? The more phones we make, the harder it is to make more. Interesting. And you might even say, having taken an economics class, you might say the opportunity costs, right, which we talked about last time, is what you give up when you make one decision. Well, you might say what we give up as we make more phones, right, the opportunity costs actually go up as well, right? So if I were to kind of parse this technically, we'd say the opportunity costs of 1 million phones was, if we're not making any, was 1 million bikes, right? That's for our factory here. When we produce an additional 1 million phones, given we're already making 1 million phones, the opportunity costs are now 2 million bikes, right? We're giving up more and more as we produce more additional phones, right? So let's put all this information on a graph, right? We'll see it's a wonderful way to compress all of these principles that we've discussed here, and we might get a result that looks something like this, right? So you can see here, and I'll go over the laundry list here in a second, but we have our observations, you know, these questions that I was asking in this stylized hypothetical situation. We see 0, you can tell my slide's a little dated here, just smartphones, 0 and 15 million bikes, right? That was our first combination when we did nothing but bikes. And then when we produced 1 million phones, bike production fell to 14, right? When we produced an additional 1 million phones, that's this distance here, bike production now fell by 14, went from 14 to 12, right? So in a couple of, there's a couple different ways of thinking about this, and a couple of interesting things to note. First of all, this curve gives us a nice visual picture, you know, and you can, of course, you can imagine here what I've done is I've actually carried my statistical or my hypothetical experiment to the end. I've said, you know, in the end is what if I produce nothing but smartphones or nothing but phones, right? And you can see here 5 million is the number we would get. And you can see here when we go from 4 to 5 million phones, well, wow, we lose 5 million bikes. So the opportunity costs are quite high in that case. Anyways, just some interesting things about this. A very simple graphical representation of what is possible and what isn't, right? So you can see, and in fact, the first point I gave you was 14 million. That's below the curve, right? Inside the curve. Anything inside the curve is certainly possible, right? But we would say that anything inside the curve is inefficient. Well, why? It's because, now we can see it on the graph, it's because when we're inside the curve, we can do more of everything, right? In my simple example, we could go from 14 to 15, right? Just by thinking, or just by reorganizing and not adding any more materials, right? I slipped that past you, I guess. But just by being efficient, right? So the implication is any point inside of the curve is possible but not efficient, in that we could be more efficient and move to the northeast, and that would give us more stuff, more of everything, which is typically better if you're a factory. Well, one thing that's interesting about this is we now have a precise definition of what it means to be producing efficiently. It means to be on the curve, right? Not below it, but on it, right? We also maybe get another little result here, and this is my third bullet point, which is that if production is efficient, there will be trade-offs, right? It's no longer possible to go from 14 to 15 and just make more bikes, right? If we are doing everything efficiently, whenever we want to do more of one thing, we're going to have to do something less of something else, right? If we want more phones, we're going to have to produce fewer bikes. There's no way around it if we're up against it already, right, on the efficient frontier. So, just a couple of implications from that. Now, it says that there isn't, another thing you might observe here is we've said nothing about which of these efficient points that we actually want to produce, right? We've just said that if we are producing efficiently, well, that implies that we have all of these choices. These are our choices among efficient alternatives, right? And we haven't figured out what combination we should produce. Of course, if we were a factory owner, or if we were a CEO, we might want to produce choose the combination that made the most revenue, right? So that we're not going to talk about that yet, but I'll throw that out there. One other interesting thing is you can see here the consequences of this, I guess you could say, of the fact that these opportunity costs are increasing. You can see the geometric consequence, right? That the curve has this kind of concave to the origin shape, right? It's kind of sloped like this. And you might think about that as the geometric consequence, right, of these opportunity costs increasing, right? It's kind of a lot there, right? It gives you a sort of if nothing else, it's an interesting characterization of efficiency and the choices, or the menu of choice, I'll put it that way, that we might have available. Okay, well, using this production possibilities frontier, I don't know if I mentioned that, that's what it's called, by the way, we can just look at it and kind of see, by thinking about the slope, effectively, what the opportunity costs are of producing more more phones, given we're producing a certain number of bikes. So, for example, you can see here, if we were to go from 3 million to 4 million phones, well, that implies that we're going from 9 million to 5 million bikes, and that's roughly the slope, right, of the line at this point, right? Not exactly, but that's, if we were to do it really precisely, it would be exactly the slope. So the slope here gives us the opportunity costs, right? In fact, you know what we can do? I didn't have it in my graph, my notes here to do it, I don't think, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. Let's see. I'm going to rely on you to kind of memorize this here. And what we can do is we can actually graph the opportunity costs out here, right? So let's see, I'll put number of phones here, like that. Put number of bikes given up there, and I learned from my lecture last time that it's better if I put this lower. You can see more of it anyways. And so what do we have here? Well, we have a 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so if we're producing 0 phones, we don't give up any bikes at all, right? So that gives us a point like this. When we produce that first 1 million, by the way, this is phones in millions, this is bikes in millions. When we produce that first 1 million phones, how many bikes do we give up? It was 1 million, right? And when we produce that second, I'll show you on the graph in a second, when we go from 1 to 2 million phones, well, we saw that the additional bikes that we give up, right, go from 1 to 2, right? So I'll show you what I'm graphing here. I'm going to walk back and forth here a lot. What I'm saying here is that as we go from 0 to 1, bikes drop from 15 to 14, that's 1 million. When we go from 1 to 2, bikes drop from 14 to 12, that's where I get my 2 million, right? These are the opportunity costs of each additional unit. Yes?
Wouldn't it be 3 million? For giving us 3 million bikes?
Okay, it's true. So this is a very interesting thing, and we're going to be much more clear about this in future lectures. But we're thinking about the costs of the additional unit, not the total units, right? And I'm really glad you asked that question, because this is a constant thing we'll have to think about. What are the additional costs we incur versus what are the total costs we incur? The additional costs we will soon learn to know and love as marginal costs, and that's distinct from total costs. Marginal costs, we will see, are really the key to economic decision making, right? When we do an additional amount of one thing, what do we give up in terms of something else? That's a marginal cost. Or in this case, it's the same as our opportunity cost. So continuing on, I think you can see what's going to happen if we keep graphing these changes, right? We go kind of like this. We'll have 3, so on and so forth, and we get this graph of how the opportunity costs are changing as we keep continually increase phone production. Yes?
But why is it still not 6 bikes given up from 1 to 2, even though...
From 1 to 2.
Yeah, why is it 1 million bikes, not 6?
Oh, from right here?
From 1 to 2 phones made.
Okay.
Bikes given up shouldn't be 6 million.
I don't think so. Let me.
Because if on the previous slide it says.
I'll try to. Nine. This isn't great, but we had something like this, right? And this is the PPF here, right? So this is phones, bikes. And so as we go to 1 here, this goes from 15 to 14, right? And that's my 1 that I'm graphing here.
Yeah.
When we go from 1 to 2, I know my scale's messed up here. This goes from 14 to 12, right? And that's my 2 here, right? This change, right? Does that make sense? If I go to 3, I think this goes to 9, right? And then this 12 to 9 is 3, and that becomes my 3 up here. All right, good. Got the aha moment. Perfect. All right, so, and I might say that, one thing about economic ideas in general, and some of you might be saying, oh, well, I'm going too fast, some might be saying I'm going too slow, is that they usually take a little bit more thought than is immediately obvious, right? So sometimes you might have to go back and look at the lecture notes, and well, that's what the homework is for as well, right? So I can make a pitch for doing the homework as we're working in the class here. So really the whole reason I was doing this was to show you, as we produce more phones and we graph the opportunity costs of producing phones, it's going up, right? It's going up. Now, this is what I have here in my 4th bullet point, the principle of increasing costs. And we think of this as a general principle, right? That as you keep doing more and more and more of something, the opportunity costs of doing a little bit more of it are higher, right? They go up. The more you do of one thing, the higher the opportunity costs of doing a little bit more of that thing are, right? This is a general principle, which we will see is in some ways the key to understanding market supply, right? And I'm going to leave aside, I'm kind of moving slower than I would have liked for good reasons. We'll think about technological change and economic growth and all of that stuff next time in terms of the PPF. But we think of this increasing costs as a general principle. Doing more of something means it's progressively more costly, right? And this, you might even have heard people say, two sort of things on that, 2 points. You might have heard people say that if you want to get more of something, you need to increase its price. That's the heart of the matter right there, because of this principle. The other thing I can say is, and I shouldn't say it, but I'm going to anyway, and I might frighten some of you, is that maybe now you can see why economists like calculus. If you've taken a calculus class in high school, if you haven't, of course it's fine. You can see that what we're doing is we're talking about totals and changes and we're graphing them. These are basically, this is the operation of taking a derivative in calculus and all that stuff. So one reason why I say that is because I was a terrible calculus student until I started taking economics. And then it all kind of fell into place for me. I sort of understood what all the things were, right? What all the derivatives and integrals and all of that stuff were about. Of course, you don't have to know any of that until you become an economics major, right? Anyways, so let's think about this briefly. I'm going to give you another example of this principle of increasing costs. We kind of derived it from my PPF example. But let's just think about whether or not this concept generalizes. We talked about bikes and phones, right? So let me ask you, if I changed the goods that my factory produced, would that really change the basic economics underlying the situation? The ideas that we developed? What if I changed it to bikes and laptops? Right? Or if I changed it from motorcycles, I changed bikes to motorcycles, we have motorcycles and laptops. Would that really change any of the basic ideas? Not really, right? The ideas are much the same. What if we went a little bit more drastically and we thought maybe about a PPF for society in general, right? Suppose we talked about, let's see here, agricultural goods and manufacturing goods. I would argue that the general principles haven't changed all that much, right? We have a fixed amount of resources, some of which are suited to producing one thing, some of which are more suited to producing the other. And so if we do, as we move from left to right, in effect, on our graph, we'll have much the same effect. Of course, the units and everything change, right? So I would argue that changing any of these things doesn't really change the fundamental economics of the situation. So maybe I'll plant that in your mind and I'll say, well, maybe you can think of something that does, right? That would change this. Okay, I'll get to that in a second, and it's a slightly different look at the same concept. One thing we like to do, by the way, as economists, is we like to, you might say, well, this is all great, Baker, but in the real world, there aren't just two goods, right? There isn't just, bikes and phones. There isn't just, even in my more, agriculture and manufacturing, you might think education, healthcare, whatever, There's never just two goods. So you might think that's a problem. Well, as economists, we have this trick, you might call it situational adaptation of the model, where we sort of put one good of interest on, say, the horizontal axis, and then we put everything else on the y-axis, right? So if we're interested in healthcare, right, we're studying health or education, we put that as our good on the x-axis, and then we put everything else on the y-axis. So you might say consumption and healthcare, consumption and education. And in this way we can take our specific set of ideas that we built up in this factory example and sort of think about all kinds of situations, right? All kinds of situations here. So it turns out that, you might think about this as if we wanted to generalize this example to something that doesn't look quite as much like production, we could also do that. And I'm going to give you a quick example of how this might work and why this principle of increasing costs doesn't have to be wedded to the PPF, even though the PPF gives us a pretty clear idea how it works, right? So here I have my, here's my situation. Once again, we have the specific situation that we're starting with, right? And we'll build an example that maybe is a little bit amusing, but then we can think about whether or not it applies generally and how it does. So let's think about me on a typical Sunday afternoon, maybe this coming Sunday because NFL season starts today, right? So let's suppose there's some things I don't want to do, like job-related tasks that I could be doing. We'll suppose each takes about 3 hours to do, and I have 12 hours of time, discretionary time we'll call it. So here we get the components of my example that are designed to just develop the general idea. So let's see, I have a research paper I could edit, right? I'll put this jobs. I have a research paper I could edit. Maybe I have to correct exams, right? I have a, let's see, what else do I got? Lecture notes. And theses, comments, reading, theses. I'll just put it to pick up the pace here. And then I have my leisure activities here, right? So, and I'll turn this off in a second, so it's just so I don't forget. Let's see, there's football. There's fishing. There's movies. Nap, right? Okay. Now, up until this Sunday, most of those work-related things I didn't have to. They weren't on my list, right? So I could do all 4 of the leisure activities on the left, right? But let's suppose that as the semester starts, I have tasks that I have to do. One of which is I have to edit a paper. We'll say I have to get it done by Monday. So now I have this to do. But what I'm going to have to do is I was previously filling up my Sunday with these 4 leisure activities. Now what I have to do is give up one, right? Which one should I give up? Fishing. Okay, so maybe I decide to give up fishing. Why did you say fishing? Because not everybody likes to fish. It seems maybe it's cold out, it's a pain, you've got equipment and there's the bait and all that stuff. Fishing. Okay, so we give up fishing, right? Why didn't you pick football?
It's a hobby of yours.
That could be. Maybe I should appeal to my own preferences here. But maybe I'll just put it on you here and suppose your preferences are my preferences. Yes?
I'd say fishing probably takes more time than football because you actually have to sit there and look.
Good point. But let's try to. We're going to try to hew to our assumption that each of these takes exactly 3 hours. So once again, you're pushing my assumptions. That's fine. Yes.
Well, what if you can edit the paper while you're waiting for the
Well, suppose I can't, right? So once again, push the assumptions, right? And you have to sort of, and so that was kind of if you think about the PPF, that question was about efficiency, right? What if you're not doing things efficiently? Then I could do more of everything, but I'm supposing I can't. We had a comment way over there, yes? Yeah? Okay, and this is good. I'll take yours and then I'll move on here, but I'm liking where this is going, yes.
Let's say sports boosts your cognitive ability.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I like to boost cognitive ability. I'm going to move on here. But really what we're doing here is you're saying when I have something, when I have to do one thing, edit a paper, I look at my list of leisure activities and I give up my least favorite leisure activity first, right? That is to say, I give up the activity with the lowest opportunity cost for me, right? The thing I want to do the least, even though I want to do all of those things, I start with that. And most of you said fishing because you don't want to go fishing, Well, let's suppose now I have another thing I have to do. I have to get some lecture notes ready, right? Now I'm in a real bind. I have 2 things I have to do. It's going to take up 6 hours, right? I have to think about what leisure activity I give up next. Well, maybe my kids really want to go see this movie, and I'm looking forward to watching the opening game of the football season. I didn't want to do it, but I'm going to have to give up my nap, right? Too bad. But you can see what's happening, right? As I have more things to do on that jobs list, it gets more uncomfortable for me on that leisure list, right? The things that I have to give up, I'm valuing progressively more and more. So you can see how this is go. If now the decisions get really tight. The theses, if I have to read some theses, what do I do? Now I'm torn between football and the movies, right? Do I bring my kids to a movie, or do I sit on the couch and watch football? Tough decision. And maybe I'll leave it at that and let you kind of, So, one of them might watch this video one day, so. Anyways, hopefully you get the idea that this idea of increasing costs is maybe a little bit more general than just looking at, the production possibilities frontier, right? We might, just because of the way people behave, you typically give up the lowest cost things first when we're talking about time, and that's another way we might arrive at this PPF. Maybe, and you might even, if you look at this example in a certain way, you might even realize that it is kind of a production possibilities frontier in my mind, right? Okay. Interestingly, we can, some things that we might want to do with models, we can do as well. So what we're going to do here is take a quick look at specialization and trade, and this is the so-called Ricardian model of comparative advantage. That is to say that it's called Ricardian because it was created by David Ricardo, who is a great classical economist writing in the early part of the 19th century, the 1800s, right? And he was a pretty fascinating character. He made a lot of money in the stock market, retired early. I say here was a late starter. What I mean by that was he didn't really start doing economics as we understand it until he was well into his 30s, I think, at which point he read The Wealth of Nations, written by Adam Smith. Maybe we'll talk about that book a bit more. And then he just started in with the numbers, right, trying to think about, well, can I make numerical examples that make sense out of this, some of these principles? And then along the way, he discovered a whole bunch of different things. And one of these things that he discovered was the so-called law of comparative advantage, right? Which really results when we take 2 countries, say, with two PPFs, 2 different production possibilities frontiers, and we put them together. And we say, what would happen if we allowed trade between these 2? Put another way, what happens to each country's production possibilities when they have this ability to trade with other countries? Now, we'll see that what comes out of this is the so-called law of comparative advantage, right? And what it says effectively is that countries should specialize in what they have a comparative advantage in. What that means, we'll talk about. And by the way, this was important at the time when many of the prevailing, it's a little bit of a straw man, but many of the prevailing views around that part of, you maybe learned in your social studies classes in high school about the mercantilist system and all of that stuff. But the prevailing view was that what you wanted to do was restrict trade, export stuff, not import anything. And so Ricardo said, well, actually, no, what you want to do is trade, right? You want to engage in the world and trade. By the way, I think just for interest here, there's David Ricardo. Great friend of Malthus. A little tidbit there I didn't touch on. Thomas Malthus, famous for his population, Malthusian population. We'll touch on that later in the semester. They disagreed about a lot of things, but were very close friends. And in fact, they have you can buy books with their correspondence. It's kind of fun to read. Okay, so how does this work? And what is this law of comparative advantage? Well, it says effectively that countries can gain by specializing in producing the good they can produce at the lowest opportunity cost, right? So figure out what your low opportunity costs are, specialize in producing that, and then trade, right? So it's really an idea that says, well, if agriculture is easy for us, right, why don't we just produce agricultural goods and trade them for manufacturing goods rather than trying to make manufacturing goods ourselves? That's a very rough example, right? But it is sort of interesting that this comparative advantage, I'll touch on this, is different from what we might call absolute advantage, right? And I'll get to that in a second. I have an example here. The United States, we're a giant country. We could produce a lot of farm products. We could produce a lot of agricultural products. Well, we choose not to, produce, say, only agricultural products, even though we could probably produce more than everybody else, mainly because we would have to give up so much to do it, right? It's maybe what we're getting at here is a formal principle. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a PPF. We're going to look at two countries. That makes the problem harder, right? We're going to make a two-country example where we have PPFs. That makes the problem harder, so what we're also going to do is make it simpler. We had that lovely bowed-out shape, right, for our PPF, which captured this increasing opportunity costs idea, right, geometrically. We're going to get rid of that and just have a flat line, right, for the PPF. We'll make it a flat line, linear PPF, and this obviously makes, well, I don't know if it's obvious, I'll let you think about this. This makes opportunity costs of doing one thing constant, right? So we don't have that increasing costs idea, but that's really not the key feature of the problem. The key feature is going to be that there's this difference in opportunity costs between the countries. And so my example here has Portugal and England. I'm going to try to memorize this stuff. 40-20, 40-80, right? And I say, what do the PPFs in each country look like? 40 wine, 20 wool, 40 wine, 80 wool. Okay. I think I have that memorized. Let's see what happens here. So in Portugal, we can graph a PPF, and the way I kind of glossed over it here quickly, what I have in mind with those numbers is we're saying, all right, well, if Portugal devoted all of their resources to producing wine, they could produce 40, I should add in some units here, 40 million barrels per year, right? So you should always have a time element and, the units, but we'll just call it a 40 here. This will be wine, right? And then what did I say? Wool, if Portugal devoted all of its resources to wool production, my example had it that Portugal could produce 20 million bushels. I don't know. How is wool? Sweaters of wool? I don't know. Hopefully I'll have these things cleared up by my next lecture. So that's kind of what I have in mind for the PPF here, right? Portugal's PPF. They can do 40 or 20 or any combination in between. So I guess something here like an interior point might be something like 20, 10 is also possible, right? That's an efficient point, right? Of course, anything like 5, 10 is possible, but that would just be inefficient. They'd be wasting some of their labor or natural resources. So given this, right, we can actually take a look at and do exactly what we did with the bikes and the phones. We can figure out what the opportunity costs are, right? So the opportunity cost of producing a unit of wool in Portugal is what? Every time we produce an additional unit of wool in Portugal, how much wine do we give up? It looks like the slope of this line is actually -2, right? Why is that the case? Well, if I were to make this 11, this line here would be 18. I guess if you wanted to bust out your high school algebra, you could use some formula to use those 2 points and get the exact slope. But that's kind of how I think about it. As we move 1 unit this way, we move down this way 2 units, right? So that would be, we said the opportunity costs of producing wool are 2 wine in Portugal, right? What about, we can work it the other way, what about the opportunity costs of producing wine in Portugal? Well, let's see. Every time, if we sort of work in the opposite direction, right? Every time we want to go from, let's see, 18. If we wanted to go from 18 to 20, we get 2 units of wine and only give up 1 unit of wool, right? Well, if we shrunk that down to be kind of halfway between there, you can probably see that the implication is that every unit of wine we produce costs half a unit of wool, right? It's kind of like and of course it's no accident that one is 2 and the other is 1/2. Usually, one of these is the reciprocal of the other. And if you want to mess around with this example, you can just sort of say, well, the way I picked the axes was completely arbitrary, right? If I had put wool over here, if I had put wine over here and wool over here, maybe it'd be easier to see that 1/2. Hopefully, you can convince yourself of this. By the way, there are some examples in the homework that you should work through in good faith to see how this would work. Okay. What about England? So let's see. In England, this is Portugal. This is England. I had as my number 80 wool and 40 wine. Is that it?
Yeah.
That 40 wine seems high, the English wine, I think if you look back through my video archives, you'll find a situation where I messed up the numbers and I had the English producing wine and Portugal producing wool. But anyways, question? Yes? I would say no, right? Because you have to, this number should, when we increase this number has to go down, right? So when we go from 10 to 11 wool, we have to go from 20 to 18 wine, right? The downward sloping line means more wool means less wine. Yes? I'm sorry.
I think I understand the general principle. I guess right now on this little case is, I think, wasn't it on the slide that said if each country produces like 40 barrels of wine or something, they also produce 80 tons of wool and like 20 tons of Portugal is like 40 barrels of wine and 20 tons.
Okay, so semantically my slide is not exactly correct. It's more of a reminder to myself to set up the example like this. So yeah, you can't just you can't interpret it literally and say this is how it works here, right? Right. So anyways, if we do this in England, right, the exact same exercise, 80 wool, 40 wine, well, let's see. Every time, and I'm going to move a little faster here, you might have to go back and think about this a little bit. Every time we produce a unit of wool in England, what do we give up? Well, we give up half a unit of wine, right? The slope of this line is now 1/2. Every time we produce a unit of wine in England, we produce 2 units of wool. Right? So the situation, I've set it up, I've rigged it so it's exactly opposite. So a couple of things I'm going to point out before I get to my punchline here. And by the way, when you have to work these, you'll see in the homework soon enough, when you have to work these examples, there's certain things you should be able to figure out. The opportunity costs, you can almost always use the endpoints in these examples to figure them out. And then, as you'll see, there's a fairly simple way you can kind of check to see where there are gains to trade. And, that's something we can talk about when we get the ideas here straight. So, okay, we see here that the opportunity costs are different in each place. In particular, if we're just to look at this way, we would say, well, producing wine seems to be really costly in England, right? If we just think about it this way, they have to give up a lot of wine, producing a unit of wine requires giving up 2 units of wool. In Portugal, producing wine seems relatively cheap, right? Only 1/2 a unit of wool. Right? So we would say here that in terms of defining comparative advantage, the thing you have the lowest opportunity cost of is your comparative advantage. So Portugal has a comparative advantage in wine here. Here you can see England, we would say, has a comparative advantage in wool production. It only costs half a unit of wine to produce a unit of wool, whereas in Portugal it costs 2 units of wine, right? Now you'll also notice that if you wanted to, you could fit Portugal's entire PPF inside that of England, right? If I were to just, it would kind of go like this. That would be Portugal's PPF. So we might say that England has an absolute advantage in production of both goods, in that it can do at least as much as Portugal of one thing and more of everything else if it wanted to, right? Why is this the case? Well, maybe it's just a bigger country. It could even be from maybe education, technology, these things are more advanced in England as well. All sorts of things might lead to these comparative or these absolute advantages. So that's kind of how you might think about absolute advantage. One PPF is below the other all the way around. But that having been said, think about what would happen if these countries specialized in their comparative advantage. England produces only wool, Portugal produces only wine, and then they engaged in trade, right? Think about what would happen then. Now, before we can do that, we have to first think about, trade involves exchanging things, right? Involves giving up one thing and getting another. We have to think about prices here. And how do we think about prices here? Well, we're going to think about them in real terms, right? So quite literally, you might think about, English ships heading for Portugal, filled full of, or heading out there into the international waters, international market. They're filled up with wool, right, that they've produced. And they go out there and they trade that wool for wine and they bring that home, right? So the question then becomes, every time you give up a unit of wool, how much wine do you get back, right? You might say, what is the price of wool in terms of wine, right? That's the key question. Let's suppose it was 1, right? In the international market, 1 unit of wool trades for 1 unit of wine, right? Now, just as a hypothetical, suppose England then filled all of its ships with all of the wool that it produced, 80 units, right? And then set sail and traded all of that, wool for wine. In principle, how many units at this 1-to-1 trade ratio of wine would that net for England? Well, 80 wool produced and all of it traded would give you 80 wines, right? 80 units of wine. So what we could do is we could take England's PPF, it looked like this. Here's 80, here's 40. This is wool, wine, 80 and 40. Well, if we did that thought experiment, well, what it would do, it would now change, just plotting the endpoints and putting the line in between them, it would now put this line with the slope of 1 here, and it effectively changes England's PPF, so that now they can get more of everything, right, than they could before. Right? By the way, the slope of this line was 1/2, which is which is the opportunity cost. So you might think about it this way: rather than giving up in production a unit, right, of, every time you produce a unit of wine, you give up, or every time you produce a unit of wool, you give up 2 units of wine. Or I'm sorry, produce a unit of wine, you give up 2 units of wool. Now you're giving up 1 unit of wool to get a unit of wine, right? You're just giving it up differently. You're giving it up on a ship, right? 1 unit for 1. I just pulled that 1 out of the air to illustrate the principle, by the way. Let's think about Portugal. Portugal's PPF looked kind of like this, right? 40 and 20. Yeah? And now let's think, this had a slope of -2, right? That was the opportunity cost there. And if we think about Portugal doing the same thing, packing all of its ships with all of the wine that it makes, right? Sailing overseas, trading it all for wool. In theory, or in principle anyways, how much wool could Portugal get? Well, 40 trading at 1 for 1 would give us 40 units of wool. So the same thing has happened to Portugal, right? they've expanded their PPF as well. Once again, the idea, maybe here it's a little easier to see, the idea is because now they're giving up one wine for a wool on the market, rather than giving up 2 wines domestically every time they manufacture a wool, right? And so you can see here, maybe you can look at this and you can see that this common price where Portugal and England could trade with one another at this price of 1, right, allows both of them to expand their PPF and both countries benefit. You can even see why. It's because of this difference in opportunity costs, right? Because some countries have lower opportunity costs from doing things than others, that is to say some countries have comparative advantages, these sorts of things emerge. And this is indeed how Ricardo illustrated this idea that there were gains to exchange between countries. You can do more with trading than you can with just keeping things inside your own borders. And by the way, just in terms of the numerics of that example, I'm not going to have you knock yourselves out and work with this at too rigorous a level. You should take a look at the homework, see if you can work your way through this example and appreciate it. That's enough. But do take a look at that homework. Do sign up for Top Hat. Next time, I think, going to do an attendance exercise. So be ready for that. And have a good weekend.